Joining me now is Emi Nietfeld. Emi is a journalist and author. She's the author of the book Acceptance, the memoir, which got a great deal of attention recently and rave reviews. She is also a former software engineer. Today, she's a journalist who concentrates on families and economic issues. She recently wrote a piece for that was published in Slate magazine that I found really compelling on inequality and its effects on young people. This was a piece sponsored or whatever you want to put it under the aegis of the Economic Hardship Reporting Project, which is a great project supported, initiated by Barbara Ehrenreich, among others. So I wanted to bring her on and talk to her about it. She graciously agreed. So first of all, Emi Nietfeld, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's start with this. This is a story of your own experience as well as the national experience of inequality's effect on your personality, your life, your experience as a teenager. It begins the first time I met a rich person. I was 15. What was your inspiration for writing it?
So I had a very tumultuous childhood and adolescence, and I spent time in foster care and time homeless. And my family before that had been middle class and then working class after divorce, really, really struggling. And so when I was 15, I got a scholarship to go to boarding school. And that was really where I met people whose economic circumstances were so different from mine. And one of the most compelling people that I met, who's still my good friend today, was my roommate my senior year. And she came from Palo Alto in Silicon Valley, one of the nation's wealthiest zip codes and quote unquote best high schools. But she was miserable, just like me. And we had very different stressors in our lives coming from money and class and expectations. But we were both really suffering from the same underlying force, I believe, which was economic inequality and the way that she was being pushed in these ways and afraid of like dropping off the cliff. And I was also terrified by these same underlying market forces that were really prevalent when I was in high school during the Great Recession.
Maybe that's one of the reasons why I really resonated with your piece, Emmy, because although my family was very comfortably middle class, I would say, I kind of got estranged financially from them when I was 17, 18, and taken in by relatives and so on. And I always felt these kinds of things acutely, so acutely, in fact, that I remember I had a friend at one time, around that, a little later, around that time in the 20s, who, with a famous last name, who said he had he was going to a support group. And I said, for what? And he said, for trust fund kids. And I burst out laughing. It was involuntary. I didn't mean to be unkind, but
Yeah.
the idea. Then when I started to hear his story and the story of some of these people, oh my God, his mother committing suicide and
Oh,
all this awful stuff, but it never, we have this idea that if we're not among the wealthy, that oh well, they've got no problems, and there really are a different set of problems and stressors, aren't there?
yeah, there absolutely are. And do feel like places like the Atlantic or places I write for often, they have pieces that really focus on the plight of rich children. And there's also pieces that focus on the harms of poverty. I think both of those pieces are important, but what I don't often see is putting both together and saying, are some of these stresses that people are feeling across the class spectrum, is it coming from the same thing in the end? And, no matter how much therapy you get for your trust fund issues, or no matter how much, therapy or medication you get from being poor, like at the end of the day, that doesn't make society more equitable.
Right. And it points to, and we can go through some of the research you did for this piece because it was very interesting, but it also made me think. I was on a panel once with a sociologist. I don't know if you've ever encountered him, named Dalton Conley. And Dalton Conley, this was many years ago, 15 years ago or more. Dalton Conley had done research on Wall Street uh, stockbrokers and other people making a very upper middle class or wealthy income and found that they lived in a constant state of stress and terror about losing what they have. So, uh, first of all, that group kind of self-selects for people who have this driving need for money. They pass it on to their children, like your roommate at boarding school, right? And they feel this constant pressure. I mean, I felt the academic equivalent, right? Because I came from an academic family. I figured I could never catch up. But um, isn't that part of what you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the experts I spoke to was Kate Pickett, who's the author of the book, The Spirit Level. And she was telling me that her research suggests that inequality is so harmful to our mental health because if the rungs of the ladder are farther apart, it matters so much more where you stand on that ladder. And that it starts to make things like status hyper salient. And humans are social beings, especially teenage humans, where we are always comparing ourselves to each other, like it or not. And suddenly that has just such grave consequences. And I mean, I remember when I was a teenager, it was all that I could think about was like not only how am I going to get out of this situation? How am I going to have stability and dental insurance? But also, what do those people have that I don't have? What advantages are they getting? What advanced placement classes are they taking? All of that.
Right. Well, and that's a huge piece of it, isn't it? Because we have things like the college admissions scandal that probably came up while you were researching this piece or shortly before, where all these incredibly wealthy, influential families felt that whatever schools their children could get into wouldn't be good enough. So they were falsifying records that their child had been on the, polo team or the, swim team or whatever, and and getting away with it for a while, which is legally fraud. But it shows and you look at the families. If you come from a middle class background or poorer, you look at these families. You say, "What's their problem?" Maybe these people are connected. They're wealthy. Even if their kid drops out of college, they can get them a job. I don't get it, but it's not at that point. It's no longer about meeting basic needs or even being comfortable, is it? It's about, as you say, status. It's about preserving what you have because you don't see a place between here and between your wealth and slightly more moderated wealth. There's either this or the drop to the very unequal people beneath you. Is that fair, you think?
I think that resonates with my experience and my own experience as well, like with achieving extreme upward mobility, right? Or experiencing extreme upward mobility because it's not as easy as saying it's achievement. And I think people, rich and poor, are really experiencing, where is there in the middle? One of the interviews that did not make it into this story was with a high school teacher in the Bronx. And I asked him, I was like, what do your students say about upward mobility or the American dream? And he told me, he's like, we don't even talk about it anymore
Mm,
because these students know it's not going to happen.
right,
And
right.
that was so it's gutting. It's devastating. That is not the America that most people, Democrats or Republicans, want to live in.
Right. And we have, this is why I bristle, Emmy, whenever I hear the phrase opportunity society, because all I can think of is the Hunger Games, right? You'll have your shot or whatever but it's enormously, and we take it for granted. We assume that that's the way it's supposed to be. And the fact is, as you say, during the Reagan years, a lot of this inequality began to go haywire in this country. And I think that's right. And you tie it to the fact that shortly afterwards, rates of emotional disturbance ticked upward rapidly, you write, while trust in other people began to fall. US life expectancy began trailing that of peer countries. This is, it's a devastating indictment of the system uh, in the aggregate, and so you're kind of contrasting, I think, the systemic effect with the individual effect on a person who's not dying or not, but is experiencing emotional pain and anguish. And arguably, if you're a teenager, it could set you on the wrong path for life. I mean, I hate to do this when I was young, but it was actually considered a serious career path when I was a kid to go into the arts. It's like nobody would say, "Hey, why don't you be a painter?" I mean, it's like, are you kidding me? I mean, it's you won't make a living. I have friends who are brilliant historians, history professors. One of my children was brilliant at history. He was like, unless he has an independent source of income, don't go into it. This is how much we've devalued intellectual careers and pursuits in favor and writing. You and I don't get us started, but this is how much we've devalued uh, the so-called humanities as part of this. And I think people suffer a loss because of that too.
Yeah, absolutely. My roommate, who I write about in the piece, she was from Silicon Valley and really felt this pressure of like, if you don't study computer science or physics and work in one of three jobs, you're a failure. You get that message. And I mean, I attended Harvard University, and there it's like, okay, consulting, finance, or engineering. And if you
Right.
even become a doctor, you're a schmuck for spending all that money on medical school, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and I think unfortunately that really does match some of the, not all of the economic reality, but some of it, right? Where when you're a young person who's terrified of how am I gonna save enough money that I'm never homeless again? Or how do I get the money to get out of this abusive relationship? There aren't that many clear-cut paths out. And I think that's especially devastating on teenagers who are going through that process of figuring out who am I and dealing with the
Right.
question of authenticity. So all of these pressures are just magnified 100-fold for young people and magnified even more by social media. Because now you always see people online who have just so much more than you have or ever will have.
And you always will.
There was something really interesting that one of my sources told me. I was talking to Jean Twenge, who's the author of Generations and a demographer whose work on smartphones is very popular. And she was telling me about how social media is just constantly amplifying the inequality, because it used to be you saw rich people on TV, on like the lifestyles of the rich and famous. But now you open up Instagram and you constantly see people on a yacht, people at a sponsored party. But the thing that she said that really surprised me is that there's this additional pressure teenagers are facing today because they believe that anyone can be an influencer.
Mm.
You don't have to have any particular talent or skills or family background. And so then people think if I'm poor, it's because I suck.
Huh. And of course, that's the worst possible way. It's not, I'm poor because I'm not good at math, or I'm poor because I don't like selling door to door. It's I'm poor because my personality sucks, right? Which is the worst kind of personal rejection for anyone, and especially a teenager. I had never thought about that, but makes me grateful I didn't grow up in the age of social media influencers. That's all. Um, so where, so your story though, I just want to take a brief second to talk about that too, because you begin with the roommate you met when you went to a private boarding school on scholarship. So you were thrown in with presumably mostly pretty rich kids, pretty well off kids at the school, right? I mean, this would have been an upper middle class thing to go to a boarding school, I would think.
Yeah, even though there were a lot of people who were there on scholarship or there internationally, it was an arts boarding school. So it was a little different, but definitely met some people whose parents were on the Forbes list of richest people.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So that's really a whole different world. And did you feel like a fish out of water, or were the friendships you had, like with your roommate and the other kids from a middle class background? I almost had a normal background, which is stigmatizing rich people. But was was that enough of a comfort, or did you feel like lost?
Well, I had a really great experience there, particularly because art was everything. That was why you were
Uh,
popular. It was kind of this old-fashioned in a way to meritocracy, for lack of a better word, around the arts. But I definitely would experience that a little bit later when I got to Harvard and it was like, oh my gosh, where is Connecticut? Like this place suddenly seems extremely important.
So let's talk about Harvard a little bit because you described the kind of career ambitions people have there. These are people who, for better or for worse, at least under the current system, they're the future leaders. They know each other. They have positions of influence, or will have them. Many of them have well-connected parents, uh, and so what they say, I mean, they find professors there and students there too, I'm sure. But whatever they say, the fact is they are molding public opinion and our economic future at the same time, don't you think?
Yeah, I think so. It's such a paradox because, you know, the Ivy Leagues are not demonstrative of college in America, but the students there are the people who are going to be your senator, right?
Right. And there was an interesting book called Excellent Sheep. Did you ever come across it? Uh, and it was by I'm trying to think, his name was Bill Denishevitz, who was a professor at an Ivy League school. And one of his students said, we didn't get here by being creative or original or talented in that sense. We're excellent sheep. We've learned how to respond to commands more effectively than the people around us. And that's how we got here. And I think there's some truth to that. Don't you? I mean, I think that we also have a system that, as part of this inequality that you write about, advances young people, teenagers included, for qualities that may not make them happier or healthier human beings, or for that matter, better members of society. I don't know. What do you think?
I definitely feel that way. I would have been very offended in college when I heard about that book. I was like, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe they're calling me a sheep." But then as I got older, like I definitely became more sheep-like because it like my classmates there, I think in many ways were just such remarkable people, many of whom had just the most amazing educations that you could ever imagine. Like if you put a poodle through Horace Mann, that poodle would change the world, right? But
Oh,
like,
yeah, also probably be fun, make it more fun to go to class. But yeah, uh,
yeah. But then, I feel like my dark triad personality traits were really enhanced, where you kind of learn like, okay, the rules do not apply to you. Like I get in conflicts with my husband all the time because I'm like, it doesn't matter what the rules say, like just go ask the right person and you'll
uh-huh.
get into this class, right? And that's really the type of thing you learn. And I think that's really the point is it's not even like, oh, you're studying the classics. It's that you're learning these social behaviors that will then take the group of elites and perpetuate itself.
It's funny because I've always been so naive about that. I've always like, oh, if I do a better job, I'll get in. It's never like, no, if you know the guy who, but that you're right, that is how the world works. And we see that perpetrated in or replicated in our political system, in our entertainment culture, in so many other things. And of course, at the lower end of the spectrum economically, as you write, today the situation is even more dismal. American life expectancy has fallen for 5 straight years. More children and teenagers are dying, too many by gun violence, overdoses, suicide. 1 in 25, here's a statistic I didn't know, 1 in 25 American kindergartners won't live to age 40. This is unprecedented for a rich country in the modern era. So I guess that raises the question, uh, is it because our society is being run by the winners of this competition, this grueling, extra, para academic exercise in manipulation and competition? Is it because those people wind up running our system that we get outcomes like this, or is it something else? I mean, you point out that Lancet, as well as the author of The Spirit Level, say that policies that increase inequality are a key reason why people's mental health are suffering. But I guess first I want to ask your thoughts about the causality of that, why we have those policies. Is it because we've just internalized this inequality and this idea that you have to compete to survive?
Yeah. Over the course of my research, I came across this study that suggested that as inequality increases, the amount of inequality that people think is acceptable also increases. So it's not like, oh, we live in this horribly unequal society, people are really mad about it, but people kind of start to accept the status quo. And it's very, very hard to figure out causality, with anything, with whether it's with, do smartphones cause this crisis? Is it inequality? Is it this or that? But there is definitely some very surprising data that goes back to Reaganomics and shows this huge decrease in social trust.
Mm.
Whereas inequality increases, we seem to just trust each other less and less. Probably because we have more to lose and because other people either have more than us or less than us, and we're trying to protect ourselves. And so I feel like the data to me is pretty convincing, and it seems like a lot of Americans believe that too. And that people are very, very fed up with the status quo, but it's so hard to figure out how to change anything when giant corporate interests and people with tons and tons of money really seem to be running the show.
Yeah, yeah, they definitely do. And of course, having now just focused on the lower income people and what this is doing to them, let's go back to Jane for a second. Jane, your roommate, because your description of Jane made me think of this great line from Lily Tomlin when she was a comedian, where she said, she played characters. I'm the super mom. I'm the perfect mom. I have this great job. I make a ton of money. I have this wonderful husband, these beautiful children. I feed for them. I cook all our meals. I take them to all their after school. I mean, she goes through this whole thing, and then she says at the end, if I had known what it meant to have it all, I would have settled for less. And and that line, which I think is just brilliant, uh, I thought of that when you were talking about Jane, writing about Jane and her family, again, in a piece in Slate magazine written by Emi Nietfeld. Uh, you point out, for example, that not only was Jane anxious, but that even in even in one of America's safest towns, 18-year-old Jane, I mean, this is adulthood, was rarely allowed outside alone when she was home from school. This kind of paranoia is, yeah, there's always a theoretical chance that, something could happen unless you stay home, but you're not going to live a life staying home. And then you contrast it with, what kids do in Denmark and so on. I can contrast it with what kids did 50, 60 years ago. And I mean, this was I could explore pretty much anywhere I want by the time I was 6, I mean, in an urban area. So I turned out fine. No, but it really, there's something tragic about it, isn't there?
I think so. And I'm a very new parent myself.
Oh,
And yeah, I have a 6-month-old.
oh, congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, but I mean, it's just terrifying to see what the standards are today for parents. And so much is said about helicopter parenting and how damaging it can be for kids to monitor their every move, right? Like Jane's family was not a huge outlier, at least for today. Um, but people aren't really talking about why are we helicoptering? Like why are we so focused on scheduling kids every minute? And that type of parenting behavior, it's not just rich parents. You know,
Right.
poor parents increasingly believe like that is the right way, the optimum way to raise kids. And so this research into how inequality impacts parenthood was absolutely fascinating to me to see that, you know, according to these two economists, as inequality increases in a country, so does the intensity of parenting. And so you look at the Scandinavian countries, and there's a very high focus on children being independent, you know, playing with fire, playing with axes, doing so at an age appropriate level. But in some states in America, in Illinois, if you leave your 14-year-old at home by themselves, or maybe your 13-year-old, you could go to jail. And you know, back even my in my age, when I was 12, I was babysitting. That was a very normal experience. It's like you're 12 years old, you can take care of a baby, no problem. And today that would be unheard of for most kids.
Yeah, and I think I mean, I guess there's a shell of a rationale in that in a highly unequal society, crime is more common. But let's face it, economic crimes are not usually committed against children because children aren't carrying around a lot of money or wearing expensive watches or whatever. So, and I know what you're talking about. I mean, I dated to these milk cartons that started coming out. Have you seen me? I mean, it's like, and these concepts. Actually, one place I lived briefly in Michigan, and a child was abducted, and
Mm,
tragically lost his life not far from us. But when
yeah,
we saw the helicopters and so awful. But the fact
yeah,
remains, those incidents are extremely unusual,
yeah,
and the psychological harm that's done is extraordinarily common,
yeah,
right? There's a risk
yeah,
benefit analysis that's not being
yeah.
conducted here. I wonder why.
And the economist Matthias Dobka is one of the people who wrote this book called Love, Money, and Parenting. And what he and his co-author argue is that it's some of it is about abduction, but that parents are really like, I have to be scheduling my child's time to give them the greatest chance of success in this economy. And so, like, my baby is 6 months old, you know, she can already be going to classes. You know, you're literally 6 months old at music class, at language class, like trying to get ahead at such an early age because you're like, if I don't do this now, are you going to fall behind? Like the sliver of people at the top is just getting smaller and smaller every year. And so parents really want to do right by their kids. And so they end up pushing them in these ways that can can really pay dividends academically, I believe the research shows, but can really harm them emotionally at the same time.
I would have gone insane. I first of all, I have I'm cognitively different, and so I have a learning thing. So having my day regimented like that, I tell you, I'd go postal as a 4-year-old. And so I really feel for those kids. I really do. I think it's enormously stressful. And I guess I'll close with this and give you the final thought. But my closing thought is, all this focus on individual achievement, whether you're a lower income, whether you're higher income, whether you're wealthy, all this focus on how pressure on individual achievement to succeed because you can only survive if you succeed and you can only succeed if you get ahead of the other person totally leaves out another factor that's wired into human evolution, which is the mirror neuron, and the fact that we are social beings and collective beings and tribal beings in origin, and that we could be talking about how to address the problems of inequality together rather than as terrified individuals frantically trying to make it up a greased pole or whatever. But that's my closing thought. What's yours?
I think that's so wise. And my hope with writing this article is just to get the conversation started around what is inequality doing to us mentally. Because I think if we aren't thinking about it as part of the mental health problem, then who's going to have the motivation to change it? And I actually think this is now becoming a really bipartisan issue, where a 2021 study showed that the majority of young Republicans thought that inequality was too extreme and that policies should be in place to try to make it better. And so I hope that this conversation can continue really across the political aisle and, be one tiny way that we can find something that we have in common in these really trying times.
Well, I hope you'll keep writing about this kind of issue because I think it's really important. We depend on your support here at the Zero Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.